Jane. When I was writing Narcissus Saw, through the course of writing the stories, I recognize there's a delving into the Fernie that is the Fernie of today, in essence. And in writing it, I began to see that Fernie has the opportunity to have a number of different trajectories, and that the Fernie of today is in essence a launching pad, and where the rocket that is Fernie is going to go to is going to be very much determined by the people who live here and what they do with Fernie. And so I thought that I should dedicate it to that future that we may choose, and that I hope we choose wisely, to create a community that builds on the past. And What Echo Heard, of course, is very much set in the past. The last story in What Echo Heard starts with the arrival of the first ski bum, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And Fernie's gone through a very interesting and unique, in the sense, unique for resort towns, a trajectory from changing from a purely resource-based community to a community which, even though perhaps in many respects from a financial perspective, the resource base is still very important, but the culture of our community has completely transitioned, to the point that our characters, some of our characters in this book, are showing how people who historically would have had a very different cultural approach to life adopt the cultural or the views, the mores, the behaviors of the people who have come to live here because of the and the activities that take place here that are not resource based. So that's, you know, that's all sort of a foundation on which we're going to grow on, and it's concerning, and that's why I wanted to dedicate it to them.
And are you optimistic given that? And I absolutely see what you're saying, because you know there is a story, a husband and wife team who join a ski instructor on the hill, and they're sort of longtime Fernieites who haven't skied in many years, and they join the instructor on the hill and have a sort of very different, separate experiences of that their time with that gentleman. But are you optimistic overall about the future of Fernie and this sort of melting pot of cultures, as you say, the ski culture, the tourism culture, the resource culture?
Yeah, well, and I think, frankly, melting pot of international cultures. We have citizens from all over the world, people from all over the world are coming here now, and whether they stay for, you know, a couple of hours, or they build a house and spend weeks, months, or years, they bring with them things from their cultures, and from both ethnic or traditions, and that all starts being melded into what is here. In a way, very similar perhaps to what happened in the 1890s and up to, you know, the 1920s or 30s, when many ethnic groups came to Fernie and developed the culture of the place then. So I think that we're in this very unique time of flux, and resort towns are unique in this way, that there is a great difference between the people who are coming and the people who were here, in that they come from so far away, they come with so many and frankly, often they come financially with a great deal of wherewithal. And anybody who's paying attention to Fernie real estate these days knows that, you know, a very simple house, a home of a coal miner in the old days, a coal miner's cottage, is now suddenly an extremely expensive place to live. And those coal miners, if they hear about it from their graves, they would be just astounded to know what has happened to the place, which has led me to completely forget what your question is in essence. But because it's such an incredible idea that in the course of, you know, my lifetime, your lifetime, you know, your trajectory of life was here and away from here, but always somehow here was a part of it. And
Yeah.
you and I have seen such extraordinary change.
Oh, we have indeed. And yeah, to return to the question, and maybe it's a question you can't answer at the moment, but given all that, are you optimistic?
Oh, right.
About
Thank you. It was the optimistic part.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I think everybody who knows me knows I'm a kind of realist optimist. I tend to be, I tend to see that things can turn out well when people are well intentioned and do
Right.
well. So, and that's what I see in Fernie, I think, and I think in the Rockies, generally, there are a lot of well-intentioned people, and when people come to things with good intentions, the end product will probably be quite good. And so I'm optimistic in that sense. I'm a realist in the sense that, you know, there will be some changes that not everybody is comfortable with and that will be difficult for people. And I am hearing that from people that I know quite well and have known for a very, very long time. And oddly, it's not the very oldest people. It's sort of the more my age group or a little younger, and sometimes quite a bit younger, who feel in a sense that they're being left behind. And maybe they're no matter how much they seek to adapt or try to deal with it, it's very difficult to adapt to living, you know, next door to somebody who this week is in London and next week might be in you know, somewhere in the Caribbean, and then they come here for a few weeks and they lead such a different life. But and one of my stories really does try and delve into that, because I see that. I see neighbors struggling with each other because their worlds are so profoundly different, and yet they dip into each other's life. You can't help but be, you know, being next door to each other. At some level, you will eventually have to communicate. And so that's where the tough side of it is. And I mean, it's very, very tough for a young family starting out who, you know, growing up here, wanting to stay here, and suddenly realizing that no matter how hard they work, they can never afford a home here.
Right.
You know, that side's a little more what I would call the hard, difficult side to deal with. And I must say, though, I see real efforts being made in the community to try and find some ways around that. They're not perfect by any means, but I think that hopefully people don't have to leave the valley completely or don't have to leave the Rockies and can still enjoy being in the Rockies, even if they can't necessarily be in exactly the house they want.
Right. And you do, as you say, tackle that in your book with the one story in which the little old wood began as a very, very small house and expanded with a massive garden, becomes sort of overshadowed, literally overshadowed by the big mansion that goes in next door.
Yeah.
How their worlds never actually connect.
Well, yeah, in that particular story, I mean, the story isn't over when we finish the story.
No, fair.
And I hope that I leave the door open, because I think many of the stories deal with connection.
Mm-hmm.
I like to believe, again, perhaps it's the optimist in me, or it's just me being kind to my characters, that the door is open potentially enough. There's one or two stories for me where there are one or two stories where the door is not open.
Mm-hmm.
I think will never be openable or reopenable. But generally, I believe that that in small communities, and this is something that I think one of the differences between a small community and a major city. In small communities, people eventually do have to bump up against one another, and you can close the door solidly, but it's not necessarily, even when closed, doesn't mean you're not going to run into the person. You have to somehow get through and interact with that person. So yeah, both optimism and realism there.
Well, absolutely. But it does lead me to sort of a natural question that was floating around in my mind after these having read these two collections, is there a third book of stories that you're contemplating about Fernie that takes those next steps and contemplates where the community might go?
Well, oddly enough, the next book better be my novel, but I hope, because I'm now working on two novels, but who knows? These sometimes novel ideas for me end up being short stories. Because as I whittle away and get to the nub of what I'm thinking about, and I often realize that what many people use to, many people's novels should just be short stories, I think. Having said that, having said that, I don't think that I will write a book about a future, like a futurist book about Fernie.
Right.
I think I may sit down, I hope I will be around long enough to sit down and write a book in the, say in 10 or 15 years, and contemplate the world that Fernie becomes, because I think the next 10 or 15 years we'll see some pretty dramatic changes. And I would like to delve into those, because that is in essence what I do in these short stories. I'm trying to reflect back the world that I see. I'm wrestling with problems that I myself might have or identify, or that I see other people having. And so even in What Echo Heard, the stories are dealing with problems of the past. Now, I think that where my work may take me next is actually watching some characters in settings outside of Fernie to see what happens. The thing that Narcissus has done is bring many characters from elsewhere in the world into this community. And now my mind is starting to follow those characters back to where they came from.
So you would take those characters home, as it were. And
yeah, I have some ideas percolating around that, because some of the characters from further afield in the book to me were very, very interesting. And this book is very universal in my mind. Every story in it is a story that's happening potentially somewhere. I'm not just showing what's happening to Fernie. I think I'm showing, I'm trying to show, but also delve into things that are happening throughout the privileged world, shall we say, to use that now often overused word, because my stories are set in that world. Anybody who lives in a resort town is living in a place of enormous privilege, aside from the fact that you've got this incredible scenery and these incredible activities that you can do. You have people who are generally incredibly privileged. Even the people in the book who are more the service economy that supports that. Mm-hmm. They are more, they lead somewhat privileged lives compared to, there's extreme privilege, there's, somewhat privilege, and then less privileged. We don't delve into too deeply the lives of for one, because, oddly enough, we have a certain kind of base level of privilege, I think, in Fernie. And it's not that there aren't a lot of problems and people who aren't privileged. It's just that is not the world that that these stories that are somewhat about narcissism.
Yeah. Well, and to your point about the universality of it, thematically, the element of human connection is truly universal. Yeah. On that note, you started the book with a I guess, for lack of a better word, an introduction called Untold Stories about the original peoples of the area, and sort of how you came to know about them. Can you talk about why you did that and what that meant to you?
Yes, I should have started my little talk with Kisa Kukit for our viewers, the Tanaha greeting that I've really been practicing, because I like it. Firstly, it's a lovely way to greet, and secondly, I really in Untold Stories, which is at the start of the book, I reflect upon this idea that growing up here, to not actually learn the language of the place is something that troubles me. And what troubles me even more was that when I was young, nobody even talked about the fact that there was a language that was place, and that there were peoples here before, and a unique, an isolate culture and language that the more I study it, the more fascinating I find it to be. And it really saddens me that I, couldn't, as a young person, as a child, actually begin to learn about that. Now I come to it as an adult, and the ability to learn those kinds of things is very, very different. So I struggled with how to properly include some reference and some idea of the Tanaha world in our modern kind of Fernie that I write about. And then I realized that I even actually have written a story, but I was like, I'm not sure about this, and I didn't know. Sometimes you don't know about time and place, and then I thought, the real problem we have is that we don't know those stories, and we have to be prepared for those stories when they're being told. And so I felt something had to be said about that. And I love it when I get a chance to hear Tanaha stories, and we've had some opportunities over more recent times, like more recent years, to actually have Tanaha storytellers come and tell us their stories. And it's always a great experience. Like those opportunities in Fernie, because the Tanaha don't live that close, aren't always that, they're not day to day, they have to be more orchestrated, but I find them fascinating. And so I hope I've honored them well with the way I try to handle that. Someday I hope I would love to work with somebody who is a Tanaha writer and do something. I think every time I work with Tanaha people now, I'm always learning stuff. So great.
Yeah, well, I would never presume to speak for Tanaha or any indigenous community, but I do think you handled it very deftly. And I thought it was, personally, I thought it was a very important gesture, particularly now in these times of reconciliation, to honor their presence, if you will, when you're telling a series of stories about a place that they've essentially been excluded from for a long time. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I always tell people, we have in these Rocky Mountains, we have perhaps a human history of 10,000 years, but we forget 9,850 of them, and tell about 150 of them, and it's ridiculous to my mind. In fact, I tell my European cousins, who always say to me, "You have no history there," and I'm like, "We have lots of history, we just don't know it." And it's because we actually, we chose to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Which is really, so sad.
Yeah. Yeah. And, not to put too fine a point on it, but you and the rest of the board, we've made an effort to bring that story back into the history of the district, the region.
Yeah. Yes. We're trying anyway.
We're trying. So I'm going to make a reference here to actually a TED talk by an American writer. And I'd highly recommend you watch it. Her name is Anne Lamott, and she talks about the 12 things she learned from writing in life. And one of the things she says is, if people wanted you to write more warmly about them, they should have behaved better. And while I won't point to anybody specifically, there are some recognizable characters in your stories, I think, about Fernie. But I will say you've treated them very warmly, and overall you're very sympathetic. And
I think it's funny that you recognize characters, because I've had, with a number of the characters, almost a surprising number of characters after the people who have told me, oh, you wrote about so and so, or you wrote about me. I've had a few of those. and
I can see an obvious example of that.
But the funny thing is, I didn't actually. When I write about a character, and actually the character in fiction talks about this at length, because she's the character that she's an artist, and she's a writer.
She's a writer.
And I had a really interesting conversation with Angie Abdu about that character, for example. And I mean, Angie worked on, was my very gracious and good interviewer for the book launch in Fernie. And, you know, we delved into that story because we have a female writer, but that's really the only part of it that Angie's had, but every writer has all of these issues. And any artist. And so for me, this is looking at an artist and examining, in that case, all artists and their tremendous insecurities about what they're doing. And so obviously my own insecurities about what I'm doing, but also, you know, how a community, and this is a place again where a small community is trickier than a city. In a city, you know, there are just so many people that it's easier to hide things. Here, people can more easily see themselves because, you know, out of 5,000 people, they think, well, that's so-and-so. And literally, I mean, I've had people say to me, that was all about my grandmother. Or, that was all about me. And it just doesn't work that way when I'm writing. My characters speak to me and they are unique to the story. And they may have similarities, but the fascinating thing, and one of the stories I've had at least 7 women tell me it's them. And so I'm like, you know, I know I've got it right when people see themselves in it. And if they can see their foibles, and at the same time feel like, you know, I'm not past redemption because of those foibles, that's a good thing. If they can see their foibles, they can fix their foibles at the same time, right? I mean, I don't have any characters who are Putin. There's no fixing Putin, I presume. But all of my characters have they have the usual human flaws that are much more normal to everybody, that everybody has in a way. And so I'm hoping when people are reading and see something or somebody in particular that they recognize, they see more of the foibles and problems and think about how that shadow of that person, and wonder if it's them. If they can draw from it that there's, you know, a redemption for them, or at least that they're not a bad person, that's I think a pretty good thing.
Well, I think ultimately, as I say, you've been very sympathetic to all, except save maybe a couple of disreputable developers didn't come off looking very well. But I think overall, you like your characters and you treat them with care.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not writing. If I were writing about somebody truly awful, I would even then write with great care.
Yeah,
I think the most compelling awful people in literature, in art, and in life are actually those people who have something redeeming about them. There is a redemption possibility. Purely evil people are not to me anyway all that interesting. I mean, I think there are psychopaths out there.
Sure.
And they're interesting in a certain sort of way, but they're a little bit lacking in nuance for my taste. I like characters, I like nuanced artwork, and I like nuanced people.
Yeah, and to your point about building characters from an amalgam, if you will, or an amalgamation of traits and observations of the people of the community, I think, you know, largely people should be flattered if they see themselves in it.
Unless they don't like what they see.
Unless they don't like what they see. Yeah, but you've taken an eye, and as you say, created original people from that.
I hope I have. If anybody, like, what would disturb me is that somebody, you know, I'm not seeking to create portraits. I am hoping that in creating a character, and the characters often come to me fairly developed, actually, and tell me their story. What I'm often doing when I'm writing is fact-checking what they're telling me and making sure that, because some of my characters aren't terribly honest, And this is because people have a muse sometimes, or they have something. And in my case, I realize I'm always looking for what is this? What is the issue here? Why is this person entering my conscious or my subconsciousness first? Like they kind of, and I think for many artists, something enters the subconscious, and then it starts showing up in the consciousness of what you're doing, and then you hear a voice, or you see you see something, you hear something, and you start to scratch at it, and you get more and more and more, and something develops. And as I'm writing, some of these things come to me kind of almost fully fledged, because I have some insistent characters, and they tell me a whole bunch of stuff, and then I write it, and then I go, oh my gosh, this isn't the truth.
Right.
I have there's one story in which is very particular, where I'd written the whole thing, and I went, this character is not telling me the truth, and so I was like, now I got to find out what the truth is.
Right.
And by the end of reading the whole story, I hope that for the reader, and as for me, I realized it's one of those ones where it may never get better.
Right. But even as a reader, that can often be a very satisfying experience when you get to the end and realize you have be listening to an unreliable narrator, and now you have to parse as a reader what the truth may actually be.
Yeah.
That can be very satisfying. So you grew up in Fernie. You've seen a lot of changes in the community, and you roped through what Echo heard, sort of the community's past, and now you're working through the community's present. In what ways has growing up here sort of shaped your artistic temperament, and maybe your approach to these stories in this community? Like, do you have a very specific sort of view of the town, Gordon? Do you think yours is different than others, or?
It's an interesting, the underlying tone and theme of that question, and what's implied in it, and what it raises for me, because I think in a way, I come to this place with a very European eye. So I don't know that I see the community and the Rockies the way other people from here might see it. And I think about this in the context of the Kootenay in particular, which is what worries me when I'm writing about stuff, because I see it from what I know are European eyes, and it troubles me a bit when I'm writing that, even though the first thing I saw out of my eyes were the Rocky Mountains, actually.
Right.
But I know that I have European eyes because I have such a European education, and I spent a fair bit of my life over there. I'm essentially the product of my parents were directly from Europe and from Germany, and so I come with it not just with European eyes, but also with Germanic eyes. I read a lot of German literature, and Germans have a very specific relationship to nature, which is deeply, there's a high degree of romanticism attached to it.
Right.
They love nature, and they love all things to do with indigenous peoples in North America, and in large part probably because of a writer called Karl May, who was a German who never really even came here, but wrote all about here. And as children, every German child used to, I don't think they do anymore, but they used to read these stories, these books by him. And I know that has influenced my eye, what I see here. And I look at a great deal of visual European art, and I know that I look at I've been highly influenced by that. So I have a method and a style of observation that is the result of that. Right. Obviously, the local has also imparted itself on me, but I know that my method and way of seeing has this background. So what I am always now trying to do is see if I can temper that filter a little bit and try and see this with fresh eyes as much as possible and with very much objective eyes. I think, but objective with the, you can't get out of who you are.
Right.
But being aware of who you are, I am double checking myself now in a much more deliberate way. And I think when I wrote Echo, I wasn't doing that quite as much, and it's a bit more. I remember one person said to me, one person who read Echo said to me, "It feels a little bit like a small town in England." The reality was, Fernie was structured like England, but in many respects, because of the class structure of the community and how this community worked when it was strictly a coal mining town, and when the Anglos were in largest part in power, in a way that now is not the case at all. Right. So you know, I wondered. When I reread Echo, I think, no, I'm being fair. I am being fair. It was like that. When I read, I'll see with Narcissus but even my ability to think about the idea of untold stories,
right,
I think is a result of the fact that I'm now checking myself, checking my privilege, I guess.
Yeah, fair enough. But it's a rare human trait, and takes quite a bit of work to remove those lenses that you're looking through the world at and try and see it clearly.
Yeah. You know, Christopher Isherwood starts one of his, it's either his book or one of his journals with the words, "I am a camera." And so I think about that when I write. I think, how would a camera see this? But obviously that camera has lenses, and those lenses create a filtering. So, you know, I'm trying to remove certain of the filters. But you know, and I am making judgment calls. There's clearly, you know, I'm exercising some judgment with these characters and with situations, but that's because I'm also trying to wrestle with what the issue is in a particular case. And as much as I am trying to be objective and give a fair representation of the character's dilemma or plight or issue, at the same time, you know, I have some ideas that I can't, you know, I think there is judgment involved, and it's unavoidable, and maybe it's necessary. The reader can then go, you know what, you're wrong or you're right.
Right. Well, and I think the camera analogy is a very apt one, because I'm not sure it was Susan Sontag who said, and of course I'll be paraphrasing, something along those lines about, make no mistake, but the camera is not objective.
Yeah.
Because there is a photographer behind the lens, and the photographer who develops and the photo and decides what you will see.
Exactly. You know? Exactly.
So talk a little bit about, you touched on it, your story germination process. So you ideas will come to you, they'll percolate in your subconscious, and do they all sort of, and I think I got from what you said, they don't take the same amount of germination time. Some pop up very quickly and some are much longer. Can you talk about that process a little bit?
Yeah, the reality is I never know what's going to happen. It just happens, and sometimes they don't see the thread of connection for a while. So one story that comes to mind in particular, and this book took a long time to come out. It took 10 years. I didn't think it would take so long to bring the second book out, but I realized that it took 10 years because as I was writing some of the stories, I didn't see the connections, and I didn't see the connections because I didn't see what was happening or in our society, actually. Right. So some of the connections are the result of what I've seen in our society. I saw something, and time developed that issue within our society, or developed that issue within our community. So if talking about the future, I mean, if I am to write a book about the future at all, of any sort to do with Fernie, it will not be about what happens in the future, but what I see being, the potential for problems in the future. But those will be rooted in today.
Right.
Because in looking back over it took a little bit, the 10 years to get this book out because of a whole bunch of other things happening in my life.
Right.
I've had 10 very, very interesting years, like lots happened, but I also had stories that I started writing almost immediately out of the gate of the other book. And then I put them aside, and it was only me when I was putting all the final stories together, I went, you know what? That's the story that I didn't tell that I should tell.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's, and this is my problem with my novels. Novels. Some people, the way they write, I think they just write.
Yeah.
But for me, I've written them. I'm just not. I don't feel that they're where they need to be, but not because necessarily the writing isn't what it should be, but they're just not telling quite what I think is meant. I haven't got to the nub of it yet.
Okay. Yeah. And there's two of them.
Two of them.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one is awaiting publication, or they?
It's pretty close.
Is it a Fernie novel, or is it?
There's some tenuous links, but they're not really, no.
Okay.
They go elsewhere. And as I said, my characters, they want to go elsewhere, so they're from elsewhere. Some of them.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and something you said as well, I'm actually going to have to go back and reread What Echo Heard and back through What Narcissus Saw, because it seems to me, and maybe I haven't reread What Echo Heard, but there's an incredibly powerful story in there, and I think probably the most personal story in there, which was the baker's wife. And it in your mind, does that mark the transition to the modern, that then these stories sort of carry on from? Because that in a very real way was a coming of age story, and in some ways your coming of age story.
Yeah. I was troubled about putting that story in that book, even though it's a really good story.
Yeah.
Because of the nature of the story. And I think that if there is that story is oddly enough out of place in all the stories, potentially. But I think there are connections between the characters, and some of them are very specific. I actually have used characters in the first book again in the second book because they lived long enough, frankly.
Right. Yeah.
They lived long enough to tell a story between the two books, and
right.
they stand completely independently, but a number of the characters are revisited, and in part because I felt strongly that is how a community works.
Right.
That people have an arc throughout a longer period of time, and they, in the first book and in the second book, they appear in each other's stories.
Right.
In a small community, people appear in each other's lives. At the beginning of this evening, you said, "You've known me for a very long time." I think I've known you since you were a little boy, basically.
Yeah, we grew up in the same neighborhood.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Almost across the street.
Right.
You were always peripherally there.
Yeah.
And sometimes your story intertwines with mine, and other times it doesn't.
Right.
And that's how all the stories in the book work, in essence, for me. I looked at how they intertwined with one another, and then how they intertwined with the previous book.
Right.
And I picked and pulled. Sometimes it's just a very incidental statement about a character, and a couple of the characters are leading characters, and partially because I thought they're profound characters.
Yeah.
And partially because I think they're very, very resonant of the community.
Right.
There are some people. Sorry.
No.
There are just some people who have a profound impact on the community, and they have transitioned well.
And that really is a unique opportunity, really a privilege to grow up and to grow old in a small town, and to see those, to follow people's stories.
Yeah.
You know, my wife was an army brat, and when she and I married, this is the longest she's ever lived in a single place. So it's
Right.
She's now experiencing that, you know, seeing the arc of people's lives, which is it is a privilege.
Yeah, and it's a privilege, and it's also, I think it comes with maybe something that you feel and typically feel in a family. It comes with obligation and responsibility.
Right. Yeah.
Because as people, you know, when I just happened today to see somebody I hadn't seen in a very, very, very long time. They had, because it was such a long time, and talking decades. Firstly, it's trying to remember who. Secondly, contextualizing and quickly assessing, but also realizing, you know, wow, a lot has happened to them.
Right.
They've aged a great deal, and I mean, they're looking at me, and I've aged a great deal, and you realize, you know, that you have, even in that moment, to be sensitive to the fact that you don't know what happened to them.
Right.
But you have a connection. You need to be responsible to that connection. You need to honor that connection, and you have to have some sensitivity. I think I suspect if that moment that happened to me today had happened in a large city, I probably wouldn't even realize that I knew the person.
Yeah, very true.
Because contextually, I wouldn't have understood well, I wouldn't have understood what I was seeing in the moment I saw it.
Yeah, fair.
So,
yeah. Well, thank you for that, Gordon. And I know we want to leave a bit of time at the end for questions. I know you wanted to do a couple of readings. You had a couple of excerpts you'd selected. You were going to
Sure,
read.
I'm happy to do a little bit of reading. I hope we have time for that. I don't know where we are in the time. There's no clock in front of me.
Lost track with our conversation.
You know what I'm going to do in light of, we're still, yeah. I'm going to read the start of the first story and the start of the last story, because they're quite different. And then I saw there are some questions actually. So the first story is called First Tracks, and I think what I want to say is it does not set the tone of the entire book. Each story is got a different tone, and a number of people have actually told me that they found it delightful that every story felt very specific to the characters involved, so that the tone and style changes depending upon who the characters are and what they're going through. So, First Tracks. And so this is Christmas. Fuck. There, I said it. He looked at his roommates. Some bloody mates, he thought. Not a mate amongst them. Nothing but a room full of bloody drunks, wannabe drunks, and jerks. The fucking detritus of the world. He looked at them one by one, all of them. Ski bums, bike bums, just bums. But it had been a good party. Nah, a great party. One of those random, what do we do on Christmas Eve parties gone wild. At one point, he figured there must have been almost 100 people in the house. A real shaker, and the house looked like it. Every party animal and stray in town must have shown up. That's the beauty of a small town, some rando said at one point. He could remember that through the haze of booze and dope and some interesting pill he had decided it couldn't hurt to take. It's only Christmas once a year, he'd said as he downed it with a beer chaser. He could remember someone else saying, yeah, that's the beauty of social media. Instant party, instant friends. He wondered if he had said it. Except Matt didn't know most of the people, and most of the people clearly didn't give a shit about him, or the house, or the fact that he and his mates, were going to have to clean up the mess in the morning. He thought, I've got to get the hell out of here. I can't stomach this. But where to go? When he'd awoken, he'd found himself in his own bed, naked but for his underwear. Lying next to him, a woman, also naked but for her bra and panties. He could see she was attractive. He remembered they'd fooled around. Nothing serious. They had tumbled about, taken off some clothes. Then he thought they must have fallen asleep or passed out, or was it the same thing? Then he realized there was someone else in the bed with him. No, on top of the duvet, beside him, a big, hairy, bearded guy. The man had his clothes on, a lumberjack shirt, red and black plaid. Jesus Christ, I slept with Paul Bunyan. He laughed and thought, that'll make a funny story to tell the boys. This was a new twist to a threesome. So I actually had somebody tell me that they know that house, they know that party. And they were like, and we didn't see you at that party.
There's verisimilitude for you.
Exactly. I was delighted when and then they told me and then I heard that them telling me about it. I realized they were telling me about a time maybe 30 years ago.
Oh,
These kinds of party houses
yeah.
here easily 30 years ago.
Yeah.
That hasn't changed.
Yeah.
You know, we have once Fernie became a ski town in particular. The first skiers and the first party houses, and you know, it's a not uncommon thing. So I was delighted with that. And then I'm just going to do a short reading, even shorter, I think, from the last story, which is called Friends. And somebody, I think, said something about a character that threads through. This is about a character who threads through the stories, comes up more than once. She's one of my favorite characters ever, I think. She's a good, strong woman, and I love strong women. So, Violet Young mused. Her torso and limbs seemed not to disturb the plump goose feather duvet sheathed in a starched white cotton cover under which she lay. I am disappearing, she whispered. She looked at her husband's side of the bed, empty, as it had been since his death. Then shaking her head, she said to the silent room, come on, let's haul this carcass out of bed, old girl. She tossed the duvet away and swung her legs so that she was sitting on the edge of the bed. During the night, her white cotton nightdress had wound itself up her legs, so she sat in a swaddle of cloth with her legs bare, hanging to the floor. She looked at her legs and feet, her toenails perfectly varnished, always the same geisha red as her fingernails and lipstick. But for the nail polish, nothing about her legs and feet looked like she thought it should. Muscle and sinew, not a lady's legs, perhaps a long-distance runner, a very old, very, very long-distance runner. She was happy that they were still strong. She had always had pleasant ankles and calves, and once the veins and arteries and blotches and blemishes were covered with the best and prettiest compression hose she could find, the form was good. Good enough that she still dared to wear skirts that went to just below the knee. Violet had never been vain, though she had known she was one of the town's beautiful women, but her intelligence, which she prized, had convinced her at an early age that beauty accomplished little without thought and will. Violet was a woman who got things done. Standing up, she paused a moment and let her feet get used to carrying her body. Her toes felt the short tufts of the Persian rug, the hardness of the hardwood floor beneath. The toes, the arches, and heel resettled into feeling the world. Then her feet went into slippers, cream satin mules, with a small bow across the toe piece and a slight heel. The day, capital D-A-Y, began. So I started both characters in bed, but quite differently.
Quite differently. Lovely. Thank you, Gordon. I'll actually ask Emma now. What is it? Do we throw it open to questions, or are there questions available?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you both. That was absolutely wonderful. And Gordon, I'm so happy that you read about Violet. Violet was one of my favorite characters too. So thank you. Well, we've got a question in here. Someone has said, Gordon, not having read the first book, could you tell us who the characters are? So it's a bit tricky to answer that question as these there's a lot of different characters, but
Yes.
if you maybe can give a general statement about the characters.
Well, as I did say, Violet was is one of them, and Violet comes up in a number of different stories, sometimes more tangentially, but there are, I will say, you know, in the first book, in the first book there are some real people, as in there are a couple of characters who are real Fernie people, or were. They've passed away, and I only put them in because I wanted to memorialize them, because they were, you know, they were a little bit like the mountains, I think I say in the book. This book has no actual living real person in it, and so that is a part of a change between the two. And not because there aren't some people who are like the mountains in the town, but I really did want to get away from living people that people would get confused by, perhaps draw the wrong conclusions from. And then Emma, as you point out, there are a number of characters who cross over, and it's a couple of families actually. So I think individually and together.
Mhm.
So I to point them all out, but the Trites Woods and the Violet Young family for sure come to mind.
So if we have some people on the call, if you have a question, you could either lift your hand up or just unmute yourself, or write it in the chat. Does anyone has a specific question they'd like to ask?
While we're waiting for a question, Gordon, we can remind people that What Echo Heard is still available for sale. If they haven't read it, they can, or they can
Yes.
get it from their local library.
There are very few copies still available. A reprint is going to happen.
Oh, good.
So because I think it's like pretty much globally, there may be 30 copies of it left. So I think there were some questions, Nick, I saw coming.
So
Okay.
we, question from Sandra.
So
I'm disappointed now, Gordon. I was so sure you were writing about somebody I knew, and now you've disillusioned me. But yeah, so you're right, that they're so true to life, even though it's characteristics rather than actual people. I was convinced that the writer was in your home at a party at one particular stage, you know, and yeah, there we go. Not
Right.
true at all. But
Well,
never mind,
you know,
it was just a sort of comment. And I thought you were sort of expertly coming back in a really nice way at some of the things you must have heard, even, you know, you were talking about your subconscious. There was some very, very negative feedback from one of our local authors at one point when a book was published. And I just thought, oh, you've absorbed all that and now you're spitting it back out again, but in such a wonderfully kind way, I thought. But I can still think that, even though it's not true.
I mean, what I can say, I mean, Frank, what I will say is that, you know, because I had the conversation, and it's recorded, it's somewhere, God knows, the recording of the conversation I had with him. Angie and I talked about this because I chose a female character and then made sure not to describe it like her, because I thought everybody's going to think it's her, but because it's a female character, and I was like, I don't want to do a male character because I don't want everybody thinking it's me either. But and you will also notice that it's very much the grief that the writer has around it is very localized, very specific, and not in the world of the internet and social media, where many writers are now having their problems. Whether it's Angie or anybody else, I consciously try to stay away from that because what we do, we delve into what the writer is perceiving and how the community is responding potentially. But mostly in that story, it's about what the artist feels and is there the insecurities of the artist. And in small towns, that's more pronounced, I think, than often in large centers, because people are doing exactly what we're doing right now. They're talking about somebody specific, and that is very dangerous.
Mhm.
And that's going to be the case with a number of the stories here, which is why I ultimately included that story, because I wanted readers to reflect about this idea that in a small town, when an artist works, you have to give the artist a little bit of grace because they are really putting it out there. The artist in a small town is in a much more dangerous position, I feel. And I mean, I having done it on both sides of a small town and a large center, and knowing artists in both, I can tell you, it is from this perspective much tougher to be an artist in a small town. And I know there were some other questions, so I don't want to. I'm not sure how our timing works on this.
Maybe we can just take, we'll just take 2 more questions. We have Laura has put up her hand. So we'll take her question and then we have one more question in the chat. So Laura?
Unmute. Great, Gordon. I loved hearing you read. I also left a comment saying you should definitely do an audiobook. I don't think I hadn't been able to hear you read some of that text before. It's great. It really brings it to life. But I was also just going to ask you, because I don't think you said in the interview yet, but was there a writer, I know you're very well read yourself, was there an author that might be an influence for in particular for your very warm handling of characters, which is one of the things I love about your books?
There is, in a way. I mean, I'm not influenced by. I read like everybody who writes should. I read a lot. My husband says that if there's a printed word near my eyes, they gravitate towards it, and he watches me start reading it because I can't stop reading. I was that little boy who would walk down the street walking a book and walk into a stop sign or something. But when it comes to short stories, I think one of the great short story writers that no longer gets thought about much nowadays at all, but who I always think of when I think, does a story measure up, is Turgenev. He a Russian writer, oddly enough. Here we are he would be so appalled by what's happening at the moment, but he wrote brilliant short stories and literally changed through his short stories, being read by urban Muscovites and St. Petersburgians. He changed the situation for the serfs of Russia. The freeing of the serfs of Russia is linked to his short stories describing the lives of people in the countryside. Very small, like village people, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's any one person when it comes to the short story, it's definitely him. So any other questions? I know there are some, so that's why I'm trying to keep it short.
We have a question here from Vera Maloff in Castlegar, wondering about how you came to writing. So,
I started writing when I was very young. When I was and I see something. There's a note. Mention the writer again, Turgenev. A Countryman's Notes or Countryman's Stories, something like that. I can actually send them the most. Well, you can Google him too, or online search. I don't like to promote one company over another. You can online search Turgenev, and you'll see his short stories collections. But how I came to writing was as a child, and one of the things that puzzles me is, but now it puzzles me, but why I didn't actually seek to share my writing earlier. Because I've been writing since I was very young, but I never felt that what I was writing about would be of much interest to anybody but myself. I write a lot of vignettes, and when I was younger, I would write vignettes to kind of understand or explain things to myself. And it was only when, due to the Fernie Writers Conference, actually, because, and that's a long story, I won't get into it, but it's a lovely story in that a few too many glasses of wine, suddenly a lot of other people were reading my writing, and they said, you know what, you should be sharing this, you should be yourself. And so that's how I went out into the world of writing as a published writer, as opposed to as a writer who just wrote for himself.
Gordon, can
Yes.
I add to that question quickly?
Yes.
Did you take courses in writing, or did you just come naturally?
Well, I attended the Writers Conference I worked with, had the good fortune of working with Peter Oliva, Stephen Hayden, and just blanked out, the Calgary writer, Aretha Van Herk, in terms of just some, during the Writers Conference, they read my writing and they gave me some suggestions, and they said, you should, they were the people who said, you should be more confident in what you're doing here. And frankly, people need to hear your voice. One of them used those exact words. And one person said to me that I should stop being so selfish and share. And but otherwise, all my learning about writing comes from reading. I personally think nobody can write well if they don't read a great deal, because that is how you hone the craft. By doing it, you have to do it, but you have to see how it's done. You have to understand the craft part really, really well. And then once you understand what they're doing, you have to find your own way of doing it. And by reading many different writers, you begin to see how each one learned how to sing with their own voice.
And we're all grateful you did share.
Yes.
Thank you.
And thank you for your stories. I found them such a broad spectrum of people, and I want to go visit Fernie now.
Lovely. Somebody is raising their hand, I see. I can't tell.
So Laura, different Laura, this is Laura in Nevada, has a question. And this, I think, will be our last question, Gordon.
Okay, thank you.
Oh gosh, no pressure to have a good one. Hi, Gordon. I fell right into your story so quickly, and that's not normal, or I shouldn't say it's not normal, but that doesn't happen very often for me. There's a lot of times where I give myself a certain amount of time to really care about the characters, and with your stories, I felt so invested so quickly. Is there something you did to develop that talent, or is that innate? Or yeah, it was pretty.
Yeah, I'm pleased to hear it, because with a short story, it's critical that the reader has to very quickly see a whole bunch of things at once. You don't have a lot of time to develop anything, and you need to very quickly convince the reader that they should spend the time with you. And people give novels a long time. They go, oh my God, it's going to get better, it's going to get better, or it's going to get more interesting, or because they go, well, this guy's written it, or this woman, somebody's written this. I'm 100 pages in now. I'm invested in this. With a short story, you're like, oh my God, if I don't get into it on page 1, I'm not into it by page 6. There's no more going. I've only got page 7 to get to the end of it. So, I have an awareness of that. I have an awareness that I have to paint a very quick picture that captures the reader and makes the reader want to carry on to find out what happens. But how that actually happens is harder for me to tell. But I think it comes from trying very to provide enough, with sincerity, provide enough, but not so much that you become tedious, because that's the other problem. In all short stories that I work on, I usually start, and then the job is, what don't I tell them? Because it's really easy for these things to become 30-page short stories. And you're not really trying to do that in a short story. I mean, some of mine get a little longer, but I'm not trying to do a novella. And so what I do is edit back, I'm paring back, throwing out. It's what I was referring to earlier. I think it would help some novels a great deal if somebody went through with a paring knife and cut stuff out, because there is a propensity to overshare, I find, in novels. And it's because nowadays, particularly, I think because there's sort of pages. If we do 260 pages, then we've got a novel. But in fact, what you really wrote was 30 pages that got stretched to. I'm being a bit unfair to some writing here, but I have found that. And I love long novels. I've read pretty much all the longest books in the world. Not that, it takes tolerance and patience to do that, because you want to take a cutting knife to some of Proust's work, I can tell you. Anyway, I hope that helps you out a little bit.
Well, Gordon, thank you. I have to say, I think we've all had I can go on a bit, but I feel like we've had a little bit of a gift here tonight listening to you read, and the conversation between the two of you. I would like to say such a huge thank you. As you know, your books have been very popular here at the library in Fernie with all of our patrons and with all of the staff. And it was just lovely to get a chance to listen to you read this evening. So I would like to just say these, as I mentioned earlier, these two gentlemen, Gordon and Nick, are both, as you can tell, gentlemen that love the written word. And they're also great supporters of literary arts and libraries in general. So it's extremely fitting to have the two of them doing a discussion this evening. And we felt that because, as Gordon talked about the craft of writing and the importance of reading and writing. And of course, the Read Local book series, this is what this is about. It's about coming together in the Kootenays and all these different communities, and we're listening to the same author speaking, to the same conversation. And I think, in particular, the time of the world we're in now, this is ever more important. And so I think tonight we're all going to leave this call and we're going to think about some of the things that have been said. I know I was jotting down points and things that, I need to listen to this TED Talk, or I need to read this book, or I think I'm going to read some more Russian short stories. So we've all had, we're going to go away tonight. And I think that's the beauty of things like Read Local. So I want to say a special thank you to to Gordon Sombrowski and Nick Milligan for being here this evening, for leading us on this wonderful discussion. I want to thank all of you for participating, all of you for listening and sharing and just giving such good attention. And I want to let you know there's one more in this series for this year, which will be April 21st, Tangle in Time by Maureen Thorpe. And then we'll restart again in September. And again, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes.